A very good evening, dear students. Welcome to BAJIRAO IAS Academy, the Hindu news analysis. So today we have some very important articles for our discussion, and these articles are very important for your General Studies mains examination as well as your prelims examination. So one by one, we'll try to discuss and understand all these articles in a very detailed manner, and we are going to start this session with first important topic, that is the impact of US tariffs on India's economy. Because we all knew that after Trump elected as the president of United States of America, so Trump has been adopting policies which may result in some issues between India and US, particularly with respect to trade. So as of now, India has been enjoying the surplus trade with the United States. However, Donald Trump has imposed a certain tariffs on countries like India as well. However, experts have been arguing that India should look this as an opportunity, and India should actually reform and review its existing trade policies as well as the FDI policies from other different countries, so that India can actually withstand such tariffs from countries like US, and it can also provide an opportunity for India to further strengthen its trade relations, and India can also make such trade relations more and more resilient. And we all knew that when Donald Trump, US president, announced tariffs on different countries, so he declared April 2nd, 2025 as the Liberation Day, right? So while announcing these tariffs on number of other countries, US President Donald Trump has declared April 2nd as Liberation Day, because on this particular day, Donald Trump has imposed 10% of baseline tariff on all imports. Right, so all imports which are coming into US from other countries, on this particular day, US President Donald Trump imposed 10% tariffs on all goods which are coming into US. It is important that you need to remember this particular date, because there is a chance that in your prelims examination this might be asked. And apart from a 10% baseline tariff on all imports into the United States, so US President Donald Trump also announced higher reciprocal tariffs targeting specific countries including India as well. Because as part of his reciprocal tariffs on countries like India, he imposed 26% of tariffs on Indian goods exported to US. So this could likely impact India's trade with US. So this could likely affect India's trade with US, right? So anyway, US President Donald Trump has announced 90 days relief for the implementation of these tariffs, but within 90 days, India has been planning to struck a deal with the United States so that the worst impact of the tariffs can be prevented or further minimized. However, so one thing that we should understand, US President Donald Trump, when he imposes such heavy tariffs on number of countries, he actually invoked a specific legislation that is found in US. So that legislation is International Emergency Economic Powers Act, right? So International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and this is the particular act, and that has provided US President Donald Trump with the powers to impose tariffs on goods from number of countries. And in fact, it aims to address US trade deficit, because if you take countries like China, with those countries, US is having a huge trade deficit. And Donald Trump is particularly concerned with respect to a trade deficit with countries like China. So he wanted to minimize this trade deficit, and that's why he invoked International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And in fact, Donald Trump also considered trade practices by some countries in European Union, countries like China, and to that extent India also. So they have adopted arbitrary and unfair trade policies, and therefore it is important to impose tariffs on those countries to protect the American interests. So this is the main idea behind Donald Trump when he imposes tariffs on majority of the countries including India. Now we'll understand what are the strategic underpinnings of Trump's tariff policy. Now why Trump is imposing such tariffs on goods from number of other countries. What are his strategic underpinnings or a strategic thinking that is behind imposing such heavy taxes? So President Trump has utilized the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. So we have just understood that this act has been invoked by US President Donald Trump to impose tariffs on number of countries, right? So this is International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Under this particular act, US President Donald Trump has announced a baseline tariffs of 10% on every countries and even reciprocal tariffs as well, and reciprocal tariffs around 26% on India and around 125% on Chinese goods, because US President Donald Trump believes that goods originating from some countries, they have adopted the unfair trade practices, and with those countries US is having a huge trade deficit as well. So trade deficit for any country is particularly concerning. So huge trade deficit actually means that any country is excessively dependent on other countries, and most of the goods that it has been consuming has been importing from other countries, right? So when any country has been importing a huge number of goods from other countries, its domestic production obviously goes down. So if domestic production of any country, domestic manufacturing of any country goes down, then it will contribute to things like unemployment, sluggish economic growth, and they may not be able to attract investment on a large scale, and ultimately it will contribute to slower economic growth rates. And because of this particular reason, US President Donald Trump has been adopting this tariff route to bridge the existing trade deficit between US and other countries, and also to boost domestic manufacturing. So when he started emphasizing on domestic manufacturing, then domestic manufacturing would pick up and it would likely create employment opportunities, and US would also start exporting things to other countries, and that would likely bridge the difference between US and other countries in terms of trade balance, right? So that is the overall intention behind Donald Trump's tariff policies, right? And apart from that, the tariffs are seen as a strategic move also, right? So strategic move in the sense that if you look at Chinese growth, so China has grown enormously in recent times, and Chinese growth is based on export-led growth because it has a huge manufacturing base. And apart from huge manufacturing base, so Chinese growth is often considered as export-led growth. So it manufacture goods at a very less cost, and it also exports those goods to different other countries. And the other thing that China is able to find out a number of markets in different parts of the world is that Chinese products are always competitive. Since they manufacture those goods at a very less cost, Chinese goods are more competitive in the international markets, and that's how China is able to maintain its economic growth. China is able to maintain its economic development through exporting goods to different countries. So when China has been exporting heavily to other countries including India and US, there is an obvious chance that there is a huge trade deficit between US and China, and even India and China as well, right? But on the other hand, US has been considering Chinese rice as a threat. So Chinese rice in the long term may pose threat to the US economy, US strategic interests in different parts of the world. And because of this particular reason, this is also another factor which guided US President Donald Trump to impose tariffs on goods exported into US by China, and thereby ultimately asserting US sovereignty rather than purely looking this trade war or tariff war from the economic perspective. So we should not just look it from the economic perspective alone. So it is also having the strategic dimension as well, because in the long term China may pose a threat to US interests in different parts of the world. So therefore it also has the strategic dimension, curtailing Chinese trade, right? So curtailing Chinese export led growth is the main intention behind US President Donald Trump's tariff war against China, right? So what would be the implications for India in this context? So we should also understand the implications for India as well. So it is actually having certain implications. So the implications are US temporarily suspended the additional 26% tariff on Indian goods. So we have just understood that 125% of the tariffs have been imposed on China, and along with that US President Donald Trump also imposed 26% of reciprocal tariffs on Indian goods as well. However, US President, keeping in mind the bilateral relations between India and US, decided to temporarily suspend the additional 26% tariff on Indian goods. And in fact, US President Donald Trump also given a 90 days of window period. 90 days of window period. In these 90 days of window period, it is expected that both India and US would come into a common agreement with respect to the trade. So they would come into a common agreement with respect to trade between these two countries. So it will be based on the reciprocity, and we can also expect that there will be diplomatic negotiations between both US and India, and that would likely yield a solution with respect to the tariff issue between India and US. And apart from that, this pause of 90 days can also offer India a chance to reassess and also potentially reform its trade policy with other countries in general, with US in particular, and also the foreign investment policies as well. Because so 90 days gives a window of opportunity for India to overall reassess and also reform the existing trade and foreign investment policies, which have been criticized for being restrictive and also deterring the foreign direct investment. However, so we have just understood that India is a country with a huge demographic dividend, and India is also producing more than 1 million engineers every year, and they are coming into the market. And India is also started emphasizing on skills, particularly the technical skills, and we have the educated workforce as well. So because of all these advantages that we are enjoying currently, so India can actually position itself as a viable alternative to China, right? So it can actually position itself as a viable alternative to China, and it can show to the rest of the world that we can actually provide all the opportunities for the investors who are coming from other countries and who are interested to invest in India, right? So in fact, India can become a reliable and resilient alternative to China's global supply chain, right? Thereby making trade liberalization and economic reforms more and more pressing as well, right? So apart from that, so if you carefully look into the India-US bilateral trade agreement, so there is a possibility that there might be a short-term India-US bilateral trade agreement in coming 90 days, right? Because US has already provided a window period of 90 days, and in these 90 days there may be a potential agreement between these two countries to overcome this tariff issue. India US have agreed on the terms of reference for the first phase of bilateral trade deal, and in fact both these countries are committed to finalize a trade agreement by late 2025. So if we have such a trade agreement, since India is already having surplus trade balance with respect to US, and this would likely benefit both India and US as well in the long term, and this will also help further strengthen the relations between both India and US. And in fact there is also a goal between India and US to further strengthen the trade relations, because the existing bilateral trade between both India and US stands at 191 billion US dollars. However, both these countries have been committed to further expand the trade to 500 billion US dollars by the year 2030, and that is very important for both India and US. So on the one hand, US can substantially reduce its dependence on China, and at the same time increasing trade with US would also benefit India by having a huge surplus balance of trade in favor of it. So therefore overall it will be mutually beneficial if India and US further expand their trade and economic relations as well. However, a successful trade agreement between both India and US can actually serve as a model for India's trade relations with other major economies as well. Remember that as of now, India don't have any free trade agreement with UK or European Union or even Canada as well. However, India is in negotiations with all these different countries to have a free trade agreement so that it can substantially benefit India, because India can export things to these countries, and most of these countries India is having surplus balance of trade. So if both India and US have a free trade agreement, and that free trade agreement could actually serve as a model for India and other European and other developed countries free trade agreement, and that will ultimately help strengthen and even solidify India's role as a key player in the global economy as well. Right, so you can also see what are the issues that are existing between India and USA with respect to the trade and tariffs. So they are having the asymmetrical tariffs. So that is the allegation that US has been accusing India of, and there is a lack of concessions for certain goods and most favored nations clause impact, and trade imbalance existing between India and US, and trade balance is heavily in favor of India in this context, and service export delays and even the agricultural subsidies, and US is strongly opposing these agricultural subsidies from India because it has been narrowing market for US agricultural products in India, and that is why US has been strongly opposing agricultural subsidies provided by India. But on the other hand, it is important for India to provide agricultural subsidy to the farmers, because farmers are vulnerable to the price fluctuations. Farmers are also vulnerable to the international market. So therefore Indian government is strongly committed for providing subsidies to the farmers, right? So the next very important topic which is in news is that recently a dire wolf has been revived, right? So this dire wolf already went extinct, but the dire wolf DNA has been used to revive this dire wolf. So we'll understand what exactly is this program of reviving the prehistoric animals or extinct animals, and what are the disadvantages of it, and how to move forward on this. So we'll likely discuss this as well. So Colossal Biosciences is a biotechnology company. So this is a biotechnology company, and this particular biotechnology company is specializing in de-extinction project. So what is de-extinction project? So it is a project which aimed at reviving the extinct animals, revive extinct animals, right? So this is de-extinction, reviving the extinct animals, aiming to revive extinct species through the advanced genetic engineering. So genetic engineering is a method, and this method would be used to revive the extinct animal species. So what exactly is a dire wolf and how it has been revived by the Colossal Biosciences biotechnology company? So in a groundbreaking achievement, this Colossal Biosciences has announced the birth of 3 pups. So one is Romulus, Remus and Khaleesi, right? So these are 3 pups of dire wolf revival, or dire wolf which is already extinct. And in fact, it is a genetically engineered wolf which resembles the already extinct wolf. And in fact, for this purpose, DNA has been used from ancient dire wolf remains, and scientists have edited these genes in modern grey wolves, resulting in animals that can actually exhibit traits such as larger size and even distinctive for color as well. So you can see on this image, this is the already extinct dire wolf, and scientists have been planning to revive, or they already revived this already extinct dire wolf, right? So we'll understand the credibility of reviving these extinct species for the purpose of conservation. And in fact, the main problem with the revival of already extinct species is that there is a lack of scientific proof for the revival of already extinct animals. Whether we can revive the animals same as already extinct animals through the genetic engineering, we don't have a strong and solid evidence or scientific proof for that. And in fact, the actual success of reviving extinct species like woolly mammoth. So woolly mammoth is it looks like an elephant, and it lives in Arctic area or cold areas, right? So the actual success of reviving species like woolly mammoth has not yet been proven through a rigorous peer review or even established results. So therefore, it is always questioned whether we could revive such extinct animals again. And apart from that, the extent of genetic editing in a revival of species or revived species so often involves a small number of genes, or it could even lead to incomplete or flawed replica of the original species as well. For example, imagine that the scientists have planned to revive the dire wolf, right? So they planned to revive the dire wolf. However, they need the genetic material. So when they revived any animal which looks similar to the dire wolf, there is no guarantee that the revived animal would have the same amount or the same DNA as the already extinct animal, right? So it may have a small number of genes which could replicate the already extinct animal. So thereby it would ultimately lead to either incomplete or flawed replicas of the original species as well. So we may not be able to produce the original species, but we may produce incomplete or flawed replicas of original species. And similarly, there are certain ethical concerns as well when we talk about the revival of such extinct species or extinct animals, right? So there are always ethical debates about the potential consequences of creating species that may not thrive in the modern environment. Now, why most of such species went extinct? Because they may not be able to survive, they may not be able to thrive in the conditions which are existing now, and because of that particular reason they went extinct. What if scientists again revive those extinct species? They may not be able to survive in the present conditions, and because of this particular reason it would even have the unforeseen ecological imbalances as well, right? So the unforeseen ecological balance, and they may not sustain or survive even if we recreate them or revive the extinct animal species. And we'll understand the case study of holy mammoth here. Right, so we'll understand what exactly is holy mammoth and how holy mammoth help stop global warming, and how there are plans to revive this holy mammoth species as well. Right, so in fact holy mammoth lives in the cold Arctic areas, right? So holy mammoth also plays a very important role in restoring the grasslands ecosystem, right? So it is believed that holy mammoth can help restore Arctic grasslands by grazing on shrubs which are existing in Arctic, and also plants, and that would actually create open grasslands where permafrost can remain intact, right? So permafrost under the glaciers, in fact when these grasslands are being developed, so grasslands can be able to hold the permafrost. So if permafrost is exhibited to the atmosphere because of the glacial melting, then it could release the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and it would further contribute to the global warming as well. We have already understood this. And apart from that, when we have holy mammoth, so they can also slow down the permafrost melt as well, because grasslands can absorb a less heat than shrub forests, and thereby helping to keep the permafrost cool as well. And in fact, if we are able to revive the holy mammoths, and that could help prevent thawing of permafrost, and that releases methane, a potent greenhouse gas. If permafrost is exhibited to the atmosphere, that could actually release methane into the atmosphere, and methane is a potential greenhouse gas, and that would further leads to the global warming and climate change as well. And similarly, holy mammoth also plays a very important role in preventing methane emissions, because as permafrost starts melting, it releases a large amount of methane into the atmosphere. So it actually releases huge amount of methane into the atmosphere, and it is not good for the atmosphere, it is not good for the global climate. However, these holy mammoths can actually help mitigate this by maintaining ecosystems that can slow down the permafrost thaw in the Arctic regions. So that is how holy mammoth can actually help stop the global warming as well. And there are already plans to revive the holy mammoth through the very same method where the scientists have produced this dire wolf species, which already went extinct. Also remember, this holy mammoth also went extinct. Now we'll try to understand very briefly what is India's situation with respect to advanced genetic engineering. And in fact, so genetic engineering or reviving such animals or doing any such research, so everything is regulated in India. So we have a regulatory framework for this particular purpose. So the genetically modified organisms are regulated under a regulatory framework called Environment Protection Act of 1986, right? So therefore India has actually developed a structured regulatory framework through the Environment Protection Act that actually regulates the genetically modified organisms. And in fact, recently also India has initiated trials on CRISPR-Cas9 modified rice varieties. So CRISPR-Cas9 is a gene editing tool. So this is a gene editing tool, and India recently initiated trials of CRISPR-Cas9 modified rice varieties in test fields, and thereby reflecting surge in scientific research and also innovation in plant genome editing that could potentially benefit the farmers, and that could also increase the food production and also ensure food security for India's population. And in fact, India also commissioned the Genome India project. For other details about the Genome India project, kindly refer this image. And India also already commissioned this Genome India project, and that aims to sequence at least 10,000 Indian genomes to develop a predictive diagnosis indicators for various diseases. If we have this genome of India's population, then we could understand the genetic diseases, and we could also design drugs. We could also design vaccines that can actually address these potential diseases as well. So since it is having numerous applications, India has commissioned the Genome India project to study the genomes of Indians. And even institutions like Institute of Genomics and Integrative Biology, IGIB, they have instrumental in understanding the genetic epidemiology, including the development of Feluda COVID-19 test-based CRISPR technology, right? So therefore, this is how India has already established a regulatory architecture for the regulation of genetically modified organisms, regulation of the genetic engineering, biotechnology, everything, right? So this is the Genome India project. Under Genome India project, a national genome sequencing project to sequence the genome of 10,000 Indians, right? So there will be a catalog of all genetic variations in Indians, and that can actually help identify diseases caused by the genes as well, right? So there are a number of such applications through this Genome India project. And the next important topic that we have already discussed this topic a few days ago, what has been happening was Tamil Nadu State Legislative Assembly, it passed the bills, and once assembly of any state legislature passes a bills, then it sent to the governor for his or her assent. But in this case, what has been happening is that Tamil Nadu State Legislative Assembly passed bills, and those bills are sent to the governor for his assent. In this case, governor is not giving assent to the bills passed by the Tamil Nadu State Legislative Assembly, and because of this particular reason, Tamil Nadu State Legislative Assembly approached the Supreme Court and asked the Supreme Court to direct the governor to give assent to the bills passed by the State Legislative Assembly, because it results in stalling governance at the state level, right? So because if governor don't give assent to the bills, those bills will not become the legislations, right? However, governor is not giving assent to the bills, and governor even reserving the bills for the consideration of the president as well. However, the problem with the Indian constitution when it comes to the governor giving assent to the bills, Indian constitution is largely silent on this. Particularly, Article 200 of the Indian Constitution is largely silent on this. So silent in the sense that the time frame within which governor should give assent to the bills passed by the State Legislative Assembly. So since constitution is silent, what has been happening is that governors are not giving assent to the bills passed by the State Legislative Assembly, and they are indefinitely keeping those bills with themselves, and it is the normal phenomenon, particularly with states which are ruled by the opposition political parties. So I hope you have understood this. And in fact, Article 201 of the Indian Constitution, so this allows the governor to reserve bills passed by the state legislature for the presidential consent. And Article 200 says that when any bill is passed by the State Legislative Assembly, it will be sent to the governor for his or her assent. So governor would have multiple options before him. Either he can withhold his assent to the bill, he can give assent to the bill, and he can send the bill for the reconsideration of the State Legislative Assembly as well. So if State Legislative Assembly again reconsiders the bill and again passes the bill, governor is obligated or bound to give his assent to the bill, right? So however, Article 201 of the Indian Constitution, it talks about the power of the governor to reserve any bill or certain bills for the consideration of the president. However, Again, constitution does not prescribe any specific time frame. So there is no specific time frame for the president to act. So constitution is largely silent that by what how when the president can give his assent, right? So constitution is largely silent on this. So this ambiguity has often led to inordinate delays with respect to bills being kept in the limbo for months or even, for that matter, several years. For example, if a bill is passed by the state legislative assembly and again it goes to the president, again it goes to the governor, sorry, so governor is not giving his assent to the bills, he's just withholding his assent to the bills. And even president, when any bill is reserved for the consideration of the president is also not giving assent to the bills, and that's how these bills are not becoming the laws at the state level. And in fact, Indian constitution has provided for the federal form of government with a certain degree of autonomy for the state legislature as well, and state legislature also have the democratically elected government. And in this context, the Supreme Court has held that governors or the president withholding assent to the bills passed by the state legislative assemblies for an indefinite period of time, so that actually violates the constitutional principles, that also violates the basic principles of the Indian constitution, including the federal features as well, because this bill has been passed by the state legislative assembly, which is elected by the people directly, right? So therefore, in this context, we'll understand what is Article 200, what is Article 201, and the institution of the governor or the office of the governor. And apart from that, we will also understand what is the directive of the Supreme Court to the president as well with respect to giving assent to the bills, and the time frame that the Supreme Court has set for this particular purpose. So here, all the details about the governor have been provided: the powers of the governor, eligibility criteria of the governor, and who appoints the governor. So when we talk about the eligibility criteria of the governor, so governor should be a citizen of India, and he should be a 35 years of age at least, and he should not be a member of either house of the parliament or even the state legislature, and governor must not have the office of profit. Governor must not have office of profit. And when it comes to the appointment and tenure of the governor, so governor is appointed under Article 153 of the Indian Constitution, and a governor can be appointed for 2 or more states as well, as per the 7th Constitutional Amendment Act that was brought in 1956. And in fact, there is no fixed term or fixed tenure for the governor. In fact, governor functions for 5 years. However, governor holds office in the pleasure of the president, So if president want, a governor can be removed by the president as well, right? So when we talk about the powers of the governor, section Article 161 of the Indian Constitution, so it talks about the pardoning powers. Like president, governor also enjoys certain pardoning powers. And Article 164 of the Indian Constitution, it talks about the power to appoint the CM and other chief ministers at the state government. And Article 176 of the Indian Constitution talks about the power to withhold assent or reserve the bill for the legislative assembly. And Article 200, this is Article 200, and Article 213 talks about the power of the governor to promulgate the ordinances as well, right? So governor enjoys certain responsibilities, and governor is also having the dual capacity. So what does the dual capacity? So the dual capacity is that he is the constitutional head at the level of state, and he is also representative of the union government, because ultimately union government appoints the governor. Governor is not directly elected by the people. He is also not indirectly elected by the people. He is appointed by the union government. So therefore he is the representative of the union government as well as the constitutional head of the state, and that's why it is being said that he holds office in dual capacity, right? So he is having a tenure of 5 years. However, this tenure is not secured because he holds office during the pleasure of the president, and president can also remove a governor in his or her midterm as well, right? So what are the constitutional provisions with respect to governor's role in state bills? So as we have already discussed and understood that when any bill is passed by the state legislative assembly and that bill goes to the governor for his assent, in a similar way article 200 talks about this, right? So it says that when any bill is presented to the governor, so the governor would have the following options. The governor would have following options when any bill is passed by the state legislative assembly and it is presented before the governor. So what are those options? So first, the governor can give assent to the bill, thus it can become an act. Then governor may withhold assent to the bill, and governor even return the bill for the reconsideration of the house. So however, this will not be possible with respect to money bill. If state legislative assembly again passed this bill, so state legislative assembly again passed this bill and presented to the governor, and governor is bound to give assent to such bills, you should understand this. And the other option that the governor has is reserve the bill for the president's consideration as well, right? So he can even reserve the bill for the consideration of the president as well. And therefore, Article 200, if the bill is returned and passed again by the legislature, governor shall not withhold his assent to the bill, he should give his assent to the bills. But in the case of Tamil Nadu state legislative assembly, what happened was state legislative assembly passed a bill and presented this bill before the governor. However, governor sent the bill for the reconsideration of the state legislative assembly. However, state legislative assembly reconsiders the bill and again it sent the bill for the assent of the governor. However, now what governor did, governor did not give assent to the bills that are reconsidered by the state legislative assembly. Rather, governor reserves the bill for the consideration of the president, right? So that's how he withheld assent to the bills, and that's where the Tamil Nadu state government approached the Supreme Court, because these bills never became acts. And Article 163, we have already talked about this. Governor must act on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers except in matters where discretion is allowed. So governor enjoys two different types of discretion: constitutional discretion and the situational discretion. So except governor's discretion, governor should act as per the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. And in fact, Article 142 of the Indian Constitution, it grants the powers to the Supreme Court to grant complete to do complete justice in any case, right? So it grants Supreme Court the power to do complete justice in any case. And now we'll try to understand the state of Tamil Nadu versus Governor of Tamil Nadu and ANR case. So in this case, what the Supreme Court has held with respect to the role of governor when it comes to giving assent to the bills. And in this case, the Supreme Court clearly held that undefinitely withholding assent to the bill is unconstitutional. It is illegal. And in fact, the Supreme Court has also said that a pocket veto, so that is indefinitely delaying assent to the bills, and absolute veto, so that is refusal to give assent to the bills without providing a valid reason, is not permitted under the Constitution. So therefore, governor withholding assent to the bills is unconstitutional in nature, right? However, the Supreme Court has provided a timeline for this. So what timeline that the Supreme Court has provided? So Supreme Court has provided that a governor can withhold assent or reserving the bill for the president. So the governor must act within 1 month, right? So governor must act within 1 month when it comes to withholding assent to the bill or reserving the bill for the consent of the president. And secondly, when it comes to returning the bill with a message to the state legislative assembly, then governor must act within 3 months, right? So whenever the governor decided to withhold assent contrary to the Council of Ministers advice, governor must return the bill within 3 months to the State Legislative Assembly. However, if State Legislative Assembly reconsiders the bill and passes the bill again with or without amendments, governor is bound to give his assent to the bill. However, contrary to the advice of the Council of Ministers, so if governor decides to reserve the bill for the consideration of the president, then it must be done within 3 months. So it must be done within 3 months, and president should also give his assent to the bills within 3 months. So that is what the Supreme Court has said. For example, any bill is sent to the presidential assent, president should also act within 3 months as well. And apart from that, granting assent to the represented bills, so governor must act within 1 month. However, the Supreme Court clearly said that indefinitely withholding assent to the bills is unconstitutional in nature. And in fact, the judiciary also said that governor must respect the constitutional conventions, and the office of the governor should act as a friend, philosopher and guide, not as a source of conflict or delay with respect to state government and state legislative assembly. And governor should play a larger role in facilitating governance, but governor should not be instrumental in obstructing governance at the level of state. Right. So in this case, what the Supreme Court has held with respect to the Tamil Nadu case. So in this case, the Supreme Court has actually held that, so we have already understood that the ruling of the Supreme Court came in response to a plea challenging Tamil Nadu Governor R.N. Ravi's decision. Tamil Nadu Governor R.N. Ravi's decision in November 2023 to reserve around 10 bills, because he reserved around 10 bills for presidential consideration, because despite these bills sent to the state legislative assembly for reconsideration, and state legislative assembly again passed those bills. However, governor in this case is bound to give his assent to the bills, but governor did not give his assent to the bills. He rather reserved the bills for the consideration of the president, and that's how the Tamil Nadu High Court has approached the Supreme Court. And in its verdict, the Supreme Court has clearly mentioned that a constitutional functionary such as the office or the institution of the governor, and including president, are not immune from the judicial scrutiny when delays disrupt the legislative process, because if they don't give assent, then of course it would disrupt the legislative process. And that's why the Supreme Court has came down heavily on this practice by the governors at a state and even the president as well. And in fact, the Supreme Court judgment has emphasized on the constitutional rules of the office of the governor and even the president as well. In fact, Article 200 of the Indian Constitution has not explicitly mentioned the time frame within which the governor should give assent to the bills. So, however, the governor must act on those bills in a reasonable period of time, and governor should also play a very important role in upholding the democratic values by giving assent to the bills rather than indefinitely delaying assent to those particular bills. And in fact, this is a first of its kind ruling by the Supreme Court, and many experts have hailed this judgment of the Supreme Court. And Supreme Court has now stipulated that president also must take a decision on such bills which are reserved for the consideration of the president within 3 months from the date of the receipt as well. And in fact, remember that the Supreme Court also held that this is not immune from the judicial scrutiny, right? So for example, if president or governor indefinitely delayed giving assent to the bills passed by the state legislative assembly, or for that matter parliament, without any proper reasons, then it must be part of the judicial scrutiny. They must face the judicial scrutiny. And therefore, if this deadline is missed, then center must provide appropriate reasons to the concerned state government as well. However, this judgment of the Supreme Court is actually based on the recommendations of the Punchi Commission as well as the Sarkaria Commission on the center-state relations, right? So this is about Supreme Court's judgment on governors not giving assent to the bills or indefinitely delaying the assent to the bills, and that is how it has been impacting the governance at the level of state and also violating the federal principles of the Indian Constitution. So that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much.